Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Robert Malley, conflict resolution specialist, co-author of Tomorrow is Yesterday, Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine, co-written with Hussein Aga. I don't know if, am I pronouncing that right?
That was good.
Okay, it's a rare win for me. Robert, thanks so much for joining us. I should just also say, just by way of introduction, you served in the Clinton administration, and the Obama administration, and the Biden administration on in dealing with not just Israel and Palestine questions, but you were also the lead negotiator on the Iranian nuke deal during the Obama years. Thank you for that. I'm sorry it didn't last. Yeah. But honestly, it was, I thought, one of Obama's best achievements during his presidency. But let's move on to the book that you've written. Like, what inspired you at this point to write? This is essentially a history of the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, more or less starting with the Oslo Accords in 1993. But why now? Are we at the end of an epoch, or what?
Well, I think first, thanks for having me. But I think as the title of the book suggests, we're not at the end of the epoch. We're back to the epoch that we've lived now for decades and decades, which is, I mean, at least since the peace process began in 1993, has been this pretense that we were moving towards a two-state solution. And under cover of that pretense, all we've seen is greater fragmentation of the Palestinian national movement, greater fragmentation of Palestinian territory, and a further distance from that vaunted two-state solution. And we wrote it for many reasons, partly because on October 7th and after October 7th, so many commentators were saying that as if this was a rupture in the relations between Israelis and Palestinians, whereas Palestinians' desires for revenge, for liberation, even at the expense of Israeli lives, is nothing new. And the kind of violence that they've inflicted on Palestinians, which now I think a majority of experts call a genocide, not much new there either. And so what we're saying is we're not at a rupture, we're back where we've always been.
Well, I mean, starting with Oslo, I feel like is important in that way, right? In examining the devolution of, I would say, the two-state solution myth. But I mean, the talking about it as a basically something that's internationally imposed without really buy-in from particularly Palestinians on the ground is fairly, I mean, from your end, I would say novel. Like, we have academics who speak about it in this way, particularly the Israeli new historians, but we're not even seeing most Democrats speak about the two-state solution in this manner.
No, and I think, I get it. Democrat and even some of the more progressive Democrats, they want to show that there's hope. They want to show that there's something out there that they're fighting for that is realistic. It's the most conveniently available outcome out there. And frankly, I would sign on to it if I thought it was realistic. At this point, I'm not sure it ever was realistic, but you look at the situation on the ground, everything that is happening is moving us away from that two-state solution, and it's invoked as a slogan. We call it a gimmick, we call it a lie, because it's used to sort of anesthetize people and say, yeah, don't worry, we're moving towards this outcome, whereas in fact, as I say, everything on the ground is moving in the opposite direction. Even the recent plan for Gaza is now, you have the Palestinians who are divided between the majority of refugees. Now you have a separate status for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, separate status for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, separate status for the West Bankers, who themselves are fragmented, now divided from Gaza. Now Gaza is partitioned in two. How are you going to make a state out of all that?
Okay, so I want to go back to just sort of like some of the broader things before we go through the history. What have been the most enduring myths throughout this process? Obviously, the two-state solution is perhaps the largest, but what are the other enduring myths that were present both like in 93 and then have continued on through the attempts, I guess, at the peace process?
I mean, let's start with the biggest, maybe the second biggest one, which is the US as a facilitator, mediator, moving the two parties in some kind of equitable way towards a fair solution. I mean, we could spend hours about the biases of US policy, some of them very conscious, some of them subconscious. Again, and we talk about them in the book. I think Americans should have bought into a narrative, tends to be the Israeli narrative, and so saw any step that the Israelis took as a sign of progress and were pushing the Palestinians to recognize it as such. And any Palestinian demand was viewed as sort of a negation of a willingness for peace, which leads to the next myth, which is it's always the Palestinians' fault. And that started at Camp David, where I was present in 2000. And all along, that the Palestinians, you know the slogan, never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And the reason that they are now living in the horror that they're living is somehow their fault. And then the more recent myths, again, that I got to, which is that somehow all of this is just because what happened on October 7th is because of Hamas and the extremists on the Palestinian side, and that the Israeli reaction is just the handiwork of Netanyahu and his right-wing allies, whereas both October 7th and their response were viewed positively by a majority of their respective communities. So we go through all these myths. I would say sort of one of the ones that is most important for this audience is the role that the US has played. And given the power the US had and the leverage it had, the fact that we are where we are today tells us something about how it exercised that power and that leverage.
When was it in the course? I mean, you've worked for the Clinton administration, you worked for the Biden administration, the Obama administration. At what point were you? Did you realize this was a myth, or was it clear from the beginning? I mean, and how did you, how do you deal with that? I mean, I feel like it came out quite a bit during the Biden years, where just even I'm just thinking about the State Department guy who was accosting somebody selling on a food truck up Upper West Side, but. It's become, really apparent in many respects that it's been throughout all of these administrations. When did that become and how definitive was it for you at different stages?
That's a great question, and we don't have all that much time to give my whole biography, but I think in some sense, the book is also to a large extent, a self-criticism by me and by Hussein, because he was also involved in the quest for a two-state solution, advising the Palestinians. So we both were in it. I think, once you're in that world, and we could talk about it at length, you sort of you drink the Kool-Aid, and you believe your own slogans, you believe your own mythology. And that's why I don't think that it starts off as a lie. I think it starts as a self-delusion. Over time, it becomes a reflex. You say the same thing. We're working on this irreversible path to a two-state solution. Everything else you sweep under the carpet. I don't know when it sort of dawned on me. I think over the years, it seemed more and more apparent that this quest, it's not just that the quest was an illusion, is that it served as cover, as I said earlier, for policies that were working exactly in the opposite direction. I think the last time that there really seemed to be a chance was under Obama. Even then, as I said, I was quite cynical about the chances that we were going to reach a solution. I felt that Israelis and Palestinians were telling us what we wanted to hear, but they didn't really mean it, and we were not prepared to exert the kind of leverage, particularly on Israel, that it would have taken. And after that, I think it just became a complete farce. And when the Biden administration started talking about the two-state solution, which, by the way, they only did after October 7th. Before then, President Biden himself had said the conditions are not ripe. Then suddenly after October 7th, because they were scrambling for something and they needed to assuage the domestic public opinion that was getting inflamed, Arab public opinion, they suddenly decided they rediscovered the two-state solution. And that's when it really became sort of a gimmick that was used for purposes that had nothing to do with the objective purportedly pursued.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the Obama administration. One of the turning points may have been when Benjamin Netanyahu basically decided to throw all in with the Republican Party, I'd imagine, as well, where circumventing Obama and speaking directly to Congress, in part in response to the deal that you helped negotiate, the Iran deal as well. Do you see that really also as the death knell of even liberal Zionism more broadly too, but the Democratic Party being able, and that side of things, being able to have or that severance, I guess, between Netanyahu and the Democrats.
I'd love to be able to blame Netanyahu for all of this. I think, and you know, I think if you go back to the Obama administration, I know President Obama had a lot of admiration for him, but he once told us in a meeting that those who believe that Israel is going to change course simply because it sees the light, because it's good for Israel to make peace with the Palestinians and give them a sovereign state, that's irrational. Israel's conduct is not irrational. If you don't pay a price for a policy that you're pursuing, and so the real issue was why the U.S. didn't exert more pressure, leverage.
Well, I was just going to say, like, Obama, it's fascinating that Obama would be so explicit about that realization and then just deliver all sorts of weapons to Israel, despite Netanyahu doing that. I want to get to, like, you know, why that's the case. Like what is that dynamic of that relationship? But let's go back to Oslo. What is from your perspective, the greatest misunderstanding about what happened at Oslo? And we should say this is Yasser Arafat and I guess Rabin at that time, and what was the greatest misunderstanding as the way that people perceived what was happening during the Oslo Accords?
So, I mean, in some ways, people depicted the Oslo Accords as a peace accord, which it wasn't. And it was, you know, it was some kind of understanding between the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, and the State of Israel, the Prime Minister Rabin. But it was based on a fundamental disconnect between what the two sides thought they were getting. Israel thought that it was getting security that would be provided to it by the Palestinian, what became known as the Palestinian Authority, that the Palestinians would sort of police their own. And the Israelis felt that their main concession was basically accepting that there would be some kind of Palestinian entity. They weren't prepared to call it a state. It would have some kind of self-governance. And that was the bargain that they saw. They had won the wars, and now they were giving the Palestinians something that they could at least call autonomy, self-governance. The Palestinians felt that at Oslo, they had made their huge concession, which is they were prepared to recognize Israel on the borders of 1967, 78% of mandatory Palestine. They were going to take only 22%. And they thought that was their concession. And now it was up to the Israelis to reciprocate by giving them a real state with meaningful borders, meaningful sovereignty, and some kind of reparation for the refugees. So both sides were looking at it from very different angles. The Israelis thought that they had made a big gesture by recognizing the Palestine Liberation Organization as a representative of the Palestinians and giving them some self-governance. And they thought that what they were going to get in exchange was full security, with the Palestinians policing their own. And the Palestinians thought that, again, they had made their concession and now it was their turn to get something from the Israelis. And they never resolved that contradiction at its core, and that got played out time and time again, which is why they were negotiating with like parallel lines that never met.
Was that a function of, I mean, because I grew up, you know, the idea of 67 borders. That was the only thing you ever heard. You never heard 1948 borders. Mm-hmm. Right. You only heard 67 borders because ostensibly the Palestinians, who both at once were not considered, or you know, in conventional wisdom, considered not to have had a society that existed there, were also responsible for you know, a war in 48 that you know, they sort of got it on both ends in terms of like of what was attributed or not attributed to them. And so everything was focused around 67, which in and of itself was considered a concession by the Palestinians, but never acknowledged by, it seems to me, almost the rest of the world on some level, because right. And so they were, when they were taking 22% of what was ultimately their mandate from 48, they're like, okay, we're making a big concession. How much is, I mean, because we understand, and right now we make all sorts of excuses. We have for, it seems to me, for like a decade about Netanyahu's, he's being pulled from the right. He's saving, you know, he's the moderating force against the sort of like growing, literally fascist elements of the Israeli society. There never seems to have been a notion of looking at Arafat as having similar political constraints, like that he, as if there was no domestic politics within Palestinians.
So you made, Sam, many really important points. The first point I'd make, and I'll just mention an anecdote that happened at Camp David. President Clinton asked the Palestinian negotiator to show him a map. He said, you've been here for a week already. I want to see, what do you mean by a Palestinian state? And the map that he was shown was a map of 67, where Israel had sovereignty over all of Israel, of pre-67, and the Palestinians had full sovereignty over Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And President Clinton erupted and said, this is a joke. This is not a map. It's your maximalist position. And the Palestinian reaction was, it's not our maximalist position. It is our position. We want two states, but we want two states based on the borders of 1967. We don't accept the legitimacy of the settlements. Now, over time, they even compromised on that, and they said they would accept territorial swaps. But again, that captures that disconnect between what the starting point is. Is it 67? The Israelis have won, and they're now giving land to the Palestinians, or is it 1948 where the Israelis are giving back only a part of the land that the Palestinians believe is theirs? Again, that was never resolved. Sorry, I remember you raised another question.
Go ahead.
Which now I'm forgetting what it was.
It was the domestic pressures
exactly.
on Arafat.
So in our book, we describe Arafat as the most democratic of undemocratic leaders. Think of him as a leader who didn't have a territorial base, didn't have funds, had no friends. All the Arab world was hostile to him. His only basis of support was his domestic basis of support. That's the only thing he could count on. So it's true, you didn't have democratic elections until quite late, but to call that a system in which he could just decide, which is the way Americans and Westerners often look at it. Netanyahu, as you say, has his domestic politics. So, and not just Netanyahu, all his predecessors have to cater to their right wing. That's why settlements have to construction has to take place, or he's going to lose touch with his electorate. Whereas Arafat, he's the autocrat. He could do whatever he wants. That's a misunderstanding that has plagued American foreign policy, not just on the Palestinian issue, but time and time again. Yes, Palestinians have their domestic politics, and Palestinians leader can't simply do whatever they want by virtue of the fact that the Americans have asked them to.
Well, that's the convenient framing, I think, from the Americans' perspective. If it's the way that they like to handle other, Arab countries in the region, dealing directly with a despot and none of the democracy that would have to go into it. How would you characterize in those meetings the Israeli reaction to the concept of Palestinian statehood? What are their major concerns about that? Is it the fact that it would necessitate a military from the Palestinians? Or is your understanding kind of the idea that it would foreclose further settlements, or it could be both?
I think it's both, and it depends on who you're talking to. I think there's sort of a unanimity today, certainly, but I think it goes back quite some time on the Israeli side that a sovereign Palestinian state that has control over its borders, over its foreign policy, over its and that has a military self-defense, the means of self-defense, that is anathema. It was anathema back in 2000. It's even more so today after October 7th and after the Second Intifada in 2000. So I think that at a basic level, Israelis would say, why would we? Again, we won the wars. We won wars that were waged by people who denied our right to exist. And now we're going to give them a state where they could have guns and they could have tanks and they could attack us. Look at what they do to us without all of that. So I think that's a consensual position among Israelis. And then, of course, you have many Israelis for whom the attachment is not just to the land of 67, it's to all of Israel. And by the way, many Israelis would say parts of the West Bank, like the city of Hebron, is much more sacred and important to them than Tel Aviv, which has no religious connection, certainly not compared to areas in the West Bank. So I think both of them are there. And I think from an Israeli perspective, many say, there never was a Palestinian state to begin with. They attacked us when we accepted the partition plan in 1948. Giving the land to them is just going to expose us to greater risk. What's the point? That's
the sort of central paradox, too. There was never a Palestinian people, yet they were cohesive enough to attack us. That to me seems a little paradoxical. And one other thing that I think sort of like infuses the book, and then I want to talk about, sort of where we might go from here. But this idea of like, Israel had needs, in this case, security, and Palestinians had wants.
Yes.
Will you just elaborate on that?
I mean, I can't put it better than you just did. I mean, I think we quote one of the U.S. negotiators at one point said that. He said, this is not a matter of competing rights. It's a matter of needs. And from their perspective, Israel has security needs. And again, it matters what perspective, what prism you adopt. And if the prism is Israel is isolated, it's weak, it's surrounded by Arab countries. Again, it's going beyond what it should do because it won wars of aggression against it. So it has a need. It has a need of security, and that is a primary need. And that means that if Palestinian land has to be annexed to Israel, that's what's going to happen. If it means that Palestinians don't have the means of self-defense, that will happen too. Of course, Israel will have the means of self-defense. And I just was looking back to a quote by President Obama. Again, it shows that this is kind of bipartisan, in which he said, Israel, like every state, should have the right to self-defense and to be able to defend itself by itself. And he was saying that in the context of a speech that was arguing for the creation of a Palestinian state. But nowhere anyone has ever suggested on an American side that the Palestinian state should have a right to self-defense, because that's not a Palestinian need. So there really is an internalization, which I understand, of the plight of the Jewish people and of the need for security. No such understanding in terms of the Palestinians, who've been victims of dispossession and liquidation and assassination attempts. So, and as we see, what experts call a genocide, but the notion that they would need to defend themselves is sort of foreign to the repertoire.
Is that, and I do want to move on to the extent that there's ideas of where we go from here, but is that dynamic a function of, it seems there were just more constituencies of Israeli constituencies, sometimes represented, I think, by Americans, frankly. At least I'm talking material and almost emotional constituencies, as opposed to the Palestinian side, where again, it was just Arafat, and we're not going to contemplate what the lived experience of Palestinians is. I mean, and I think so many Israelis seem to not have any awareness of what goes on just in even the West Bank, which is, miles away. It's like, I don't know, it's not even, Rhode Island is further away from where we are right now than the West Bank. But it is a world away. Was that a sort of a deliberate construct in some way, like that the Israelis were, it was developed in such a way that Israelis did not have an awareness of what was going on there, that these concerns, these lived experiences, did in no way sort of would get infused in these talks or the broader awareness?
I mean, certainly on the Israeli side, what you say is right. It's, as you say, it's also true of the American side. And I would say anyone who's watching this, just take a trip to the West Bank, visit Hebron for a day, and come back and tell us whether your experience has not shaped your vision. It is just, you can't come out of that trip and not view the whole conflict through a different lens. So, but you're touching on something that has so many different layers. Certainly in terms of the Americans, there's a cultural affinity and historical affinity to the Jewish people and to Israel, which is understandable, but doesn't exist at all when it comes to Arabs or Muslims in general. There's a strategic partnership with Israel. Israel is seen as a serious country with whom the U.S. can build an alliance. It's certainly not the case with Palestinians, probably not even the case with Arabs, other than, as Emma, you said, despots in power, but not at any deeper level. And then, of course, there's the domestic politics, which we could also spend a long time talking about, but which has weighed very heavily on the policy and on the perspective that American policymakers have on the conflict. So that explains, blindness is sometimes sort of is witting, and sometimes it's unwitting. And here it was a little bit of both.
But the sorry.
Just one more thing. Like, where have been the other Arab countries? Because it seems like in the past, there was pressure exerted on talks on the United States, on Israel, by the reaction of the so-called Arab street, which is, even in and of itself is a sort of a weird construction. You'd never hear like the American street or, the Israeli street. It's what they're saying is the population, but there's that sort of like, it's a weird construct. But
it's a connotation of a mob, right? I mean, that's what
and like,
it's racist.
It's racist.
Right. Not to find a point on it. Yeah.
But where Where have been the other Arab countries in this? Because they seem to completely be hands off largely.
Because they've been complicit, because it served the leadership, it served their interest to pay lip service to the Palestinian cause, say that they're putting pressure on the Americans, have good relations with the U.S., military assistance, economic assistance, security assistance. And when things boiled on this quote unquote Arab street, then they might raise their voices, but not do that much. Now, in fairness, the power imbalance with Israel is such that there's not much that they could do anyway. But this has been a game that has suited almost everyone other than the people themselves. It suited U.S. foreign policy interests. It suited Israel. It suited the Arab states, as I just mentioned. It's even suited the Palestinian Authority because it has been living on the largesse of foreign assistance, Western assistance, and it has sort of developed its own corrupt inner circle. So that's why it survived. It's been sustained for so long because so many interests have converged and sort of finding a benefit and profiting from the status quo.
But the overall interest that it's just so frustrating to talk around is the idea that the land could be shared, the idea of one democratic state and what that could look like, and that is, in my view, really the most realistic option going forward when we see the hundreds of thousands of settlements that are already built up in the West Bank. We see, obviously, Gaza is segmented from the rest of Palestinian territory by design, but that appears to be maybe the non-starter for the Israelis. Is that your experience in your negotiations? And is there even a consideration on that front from the Israeli side or even the Palestinian side that we, it would have to be imposed, I understand, but I'm curious if that even came up.
Never. No, it never came up. I mean, and even one can understand why. I mean, Israeli Jews would not countenance it at all. I think a number of Palestinians, in the name of self-determination, believe that they should have their own entity that they govern, and they fear that if it's one state, at least at the beginning, it would be dominated economically, socially, in every way by Israeli Jews. You asked me sort of when I came to the realization. I started off as a believer in the one state binational state. I mean, that's much more consonant with our own moral and ethical view. And I mean the theoretical American ethical and moral view. I don't think it's realistic today. I don't know what generations from now Israelis and Palestinians will do. But one of the core messages of our book is let's stop sort of bang our head and say two states, two states, two states when there's no mechanism that's going to make it happen. You mentioned the settlements. There's so many other reasons. There has to be something. I mean, it could, unfortunately, the most likely outcome is the status quo only getting worse with more ethnic cleansing, more displacement of Palestinians, more land grabs. But there hopefully is some other way that is not two states, that may not be the one state as you just described it, but which allows both sides to govern themselves, to live, to coexist peacefully. I don't have that answer right now. And who knows how it will come. When it will come, it will require changes on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, and on one place where the change may be coming, which is on the American side.
Well, that's the one thing where I just like the two-state solution. I'm so in agreement with you on the sense of it being unrealistic, but there's also a more nefarious element to it, which is that it bides time for the exact ethnic cleansing that we're talking about here. So your book is so important in that it explains all of this, but I also just feel like the urgency is not necessarily reflected when people continue to talk about it in this manner.
No, absolutely. And I mean, it's hard to break from that habit. Like if you're a leader, even an Arab leader, and you say, I'm going to move away from the two-state solution, it looks like you're moving away from anything that could happen. And so that's why I speak in private to officials who would agree with what you just said. Two-state solution is not going to happen. They don't want to admit it because if they admit it, it looks like they've given up all hope because they can't imagine something different. Now that's laziness or an expediency. There has to be something else. And, there've been many cases in history where the most unexpected occurs because people fight for it. But right now we're in this logjam where people think it's either ethnic cleansing, as we've seen, or two-state solution. And so the right-minded pick the two-state solution, even if they have no concept of how to get there.
You mentioned that there have to be changes in the U.S. and the Israelis and the Palestinians. The U.S., I get a sense of what that would be, and we actually may be headed towards that.
Yep.
Where I would imagine maybe Democrat, it's conceivable Republican Party, but more likely Democratic administration might finally say, we're going to use some of our leverage. And who knows where the chips fall after that, but that would be a change. What would be the change in the Israeli side and what would be a change in the Palestinian side that would precipitate whatever, which put a big question mark as to what the sort of like a relative equilibrium looks like, but what would be the changes?
So first, I think it's going to be hard to imagine a change on the Israeli side without a change on the American side for the reason that President Obama articulated, which is why
Right.
would they? I mean, again, the status quo suits them. Just as a footnote, I think what's happening on the Republican side in some ways may be arguably more significant than on the Democratic side. We could come back to that. I think one change that has to occur is the Palestinians need, and people need to allow them to have a representative, legitimate, credible national movement. They don't have it, and that's partly their fault. But to a large extent, it's because outside interests have done everything to fragment the Palestinians, to prop up those Palestinians who looked and acted more like, moderates, quote unquote, so they were more to our liking, but who have no legitimacy, no representativity, and therefore no credibility. So they're just there as actors who are maintaining the status quo, but they can't voice Palestinian demands, they can't represent the Palestinians, they can't have any active agency because right now they don't represent the people who they're supposed to represent. But part of that has been because of American and Western policy towards the Islamists. Part of it has been preventing elections or discouraging elections on the ground that those elections might yield the wrong result, fragmenting the Palestinians, and again, maintaining a leadership that does not have the capacity to do anything, which suits many people quite well.
I'm curious about your thought about the changes in the Republican Party and how that being more significant.
You mentioned on the Democratic side, and I'm very welcoming of what I'm hearing. My fear is that once you have a different leadership in Israel, once the war really ends in Gaza, then we might go back to business as usual. There'll be some voices who will say no.
Air's let out of the tire, as it were.
Exactly. We dodged a bullet. So sort of the centrist Democrats who now are talking about withholding or conditioning aid to Israel will say, well, that was true when you had Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing allies. It's not true when you have somebody else. Whereas in fact, again, as we describe in the book, there's nothing new. Israeli policy has been pretty consistent for decades. On the Republican side, what's interesting is that you have people for whom it is a core value, America first, and I don't agree with them on 100 things, but America first for some of them means the US should not be giving this kind of money to any country, not Israel, not anyone else, and it should not be dragged into foreign conflicts by any country, not Israel, not anyone else. And it doesn't matter to them whether it's Netanyahu or Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz. So that seems to be pretty solid and pretty intrinsic to that America first school of thought. And, for me, last week I was talking to the American conservative, this week to the majority report. I think that says something about how there may be a transpartisan view. We have to exclude all the anti-Semitism which exists on the right, but a transpartisan view which sees the relationship with Israel as having been abnormal and we need to normalize it.
I'm skeptical that movement's going to survive.
I'm sure
but after we attack Venezuela this weekend, we may revisit the idea of how deep that America first. But I think at the very least, even if there is a sort of rump part in the Republican Party that is pushing in that direction, it may make it harder for the Democratic Party to sort of settle in a sort of comfortable zone of continuing on with this policy. I also think that there's the changes in the Democratic Party are happening, have been happening since Tim Kaine refused to go see Netanyahu speak to the Congress.
Yeah.
I think we have so much more to ask you, and so I hope that we can have you back relatively soon. But hopefully it's maybe with some element of optimism, although it seems very, very difficult to imagine that right now. But it's a fascinating book, and I really appreciate your coming on. Robert Malley, the book is Tomorrow is Yesterday, Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and in our podcast and YouTube description. Thanks again so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank
to
you.
the two of you. Bye.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.